My name is Jake Thompson, and I'm 45 years old. I've been working as a ranch hand and cowboy in Montana for over 25 years, living a simple life on the open range. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how one moment of compassion changed not just my life, but the lives of two feuding families forever. The Thompson-Rodriguez feud had been going on for 3 generations. It started back in 1952 when my grandfather, Samuel Thompson, and Miguel Rodriguez Sr. got into a dispute over water rights along Willow Creek. What began as a disagreement between neighbors escalated into a bitter hatred that was passed down through the generations like a poisonous inheritance. My father, Robert Thompson, continued the feud with Miguel's son, Carlos Rodriguez. They fought over grazing land, property boundaries, and anything else they could find to argue about. The hatred ran so deep that our families couldn't even shop in the same stores in town without causing trouble. When I inherited the Thompson ranch in 2010, I also inherited the feud with Carlos Rodriguez and his family. Carlos had 3 sons, Miguel Jr., who was 35, Diego, who was 32, and little Eduardo, who was only 8 years old at the time. The Rodriguez ranch bordered ours along a 5-mile stretch of fence line that had been the source of countless disputes. We'd had arguments over cattle crossing onto each other's land, water access, and even the placement of fence posts. Every interaction between our families ended in shouting matches or threats. I lived alone on my ranch with just my horses, cattle, and my loyal border collie, Rex. I'd never married, partly because the feud had consumed so much of my family's energy that there wasn't room for much else. The constant anger and resentment had shaped my entire worldview. Carlos Rodriguez was a proud man in his 60s, with graying hair and weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. He ran his ranch with an iron fist and had raised his sons to hate the Thompson name. Whenever we encountered each other in town, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Thompson, Carlos would spit whenever he saw me, his dark eyes filled with decades of accumulated hatred. Rodriguez, I'd respond with equal venom, my jaw clenched tight. Our workers knew better than to even acknowledge each other when they met at the feed store or the local diner. The feud had poisoned every aspect of our lives and the lives of everyone around us. The breaking point came in March 2023, during one of the worst blizzards Montana had seen in decades. The storm hit suddenly, with winds reaching 70 miles per hour and snow falling so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. I was in my barn checking on the horses when I heard Rex barking frantically outside. Through the howling wind, I could barely make out what sounded like someone shouting for help. I grabbed my heavy coat and flashlight and pushed through the snow toward the sound. What I found changed everything. About 200 yards from my barn, near the fence line that separated our properties, I saw a small figure huddled against a fallen tree. As I got closer, my flashlight revealed a child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old, wearing a thin jacket and shivering uncontrollably. "Help me," the boy whispered through chattering teeth. "Please help me." Even in the dim light and swirling snow, I recognized him immediately. It was Eduardo Rodriguez, Carlos's youngest son. He must have gotten lost in the storm while trying to get home from school. For a moment, I hesitated. This was the son of my enemy, the child of a man who had spent his entire life hating my family. Every instinct told me to leave him there, to let Carlos deal with his own problems. But as I looked at Eduardo's terrified face and saw how hypothermia was already setting in, I realized that this wasn't about the feud. This was about a child who was going to die if I didn't act immediately. "Come here, son," I said, scooping Eduardo up in my arms. "I've got you." Eduardo was barely conscious as I carried him through the storm back to my house. His lips were blue, his breathing was shallow, and his small body felt like ice against my chest. I kicked open my front door and carried Eduardo straight to the fireplace, where I had a fire burning. I wrapped him in every blanket I could find and started working to warm him up slowly and safely. "What's your name?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. "Eduardo," he whispered. "Eduardo Rodriguez." "Well, Eduardo, you're safe now. I'm Jake Thompson." Eduardo's eyes widened with fear when he heard my last name. Even at 12 years old, he'd been taught to fear and hate the Thompsons. "Don't be scared," I said gently. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to take care of you until this storm passes." Over the next several hours, I worked to get Eduardo's body temperature back to normal. I made him hot soup, gave him warm clothes, and sat with him by the fire. Gradually, the color returned to his cheeks and he stopped shivering. "Why are you helping me?" Eduardo asked as he sipped the soup. "My papa says your family is bad because you're just a kid," I replied. "And kids shouldn't suffer because of things their parents did. Are you really bad?" Eduardo asked with the innocent curiosity of a child. I looked at this boy, the son of my supposed enemy, and realized how ridiculous the whole feud had become. Here was a sweet, innocent child who had been taught to hate me before he even knew why. "No, Eduardo, I'm not bad, and neither is your papa. We just ... disagree about some things." "What things?" "Grown-up things that don't really matter." Eduardo nodded thoughtfully. "My mama died when I was little. Papa says she's watching over me from heaven. I'm sure she is. And I bet she's glad you're safe tonight." As the storm raged outside, Eduardo and I talked about everything except the feud. He told me about school, his favorite subjects, his dreams of becoming a veterinarian someday. I told him about the ranch, the animals, and what it was like growing up in Montana. "Mr. Jake," Eduardo said as he started to get sleepy, "you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone mean and scary. But you're nice." "Well, sometimes people aren't what we expect them to be." Eduardo fell asleep on my couch, wrapped in blankets by the fire. I sat in my chair watching him, and for the first time in my adult life, I questioned everything I'd been taught about the Rodriguez family. The storm continued through the night and into the next day. I knew Carlos must be worried sick about his son, but there was no way to get Eduardo home safely until the weather cleared. On the second day, Eduardo helped me feed the horses and check on the cattle. He was fascinated by ranch life and asked a million questions about everything. "Why do you live alone, Mr. Jake?" Eduardo asked as we walked through the barn. "I guess I never found the right person to share my life with." "Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes, but I have the animals, and they're good company." "My papa gets lonely too, especially since Mama died. He tries to hide it, but I can tell." As Eduardo talked about his father, I began to see Carlos Rodriguez not as a monster, but as a man who had lost his wife and was trying to raise 3 sons on his own while carrying the burden of a generations-old feud. On the third day, the storm finally cleared. I knew I had to get Eduardo home, but I also knew that returning him would likely reignite the conflict between our families. "Eduardo," I said as we prepared to leave, "when we get to your house, your father might be angry. Not at you, but at me. Don't take it personally, okay?" "Why would he be angry?" "You saved my life." "Because sometimes adults hold on to anger for too long, even when it doesn't make sense anymore." I saddled up my horse and helped Eduardo climb up behind me. The ride to the Rodriguez ranch took about 30 minutes through the snow-covered landscape. As we approached the Rodriguez house, I could see Carlos and his 2 older sons standing on the porch. Carlos had a rifle in his hands, and his face was a mask of fury and relief. "Papa," Eduardo called out, waving from behind me on the horse. Carlos's expression changed from anger to overwhelming relief as he saw his youngest son alive and well. He set down the rifle and ran toward us. I dismounted and helped Eduardo down. The boy immediately ran to his father, who scooped him up in a fierce embrace. "Mijo, where have you been? We've been searching everywhere for you," Carlos said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I got lost in the storm, Papa, but Mr. Jake found me and took care of me. He saved my life." Carlos looked at me over Eduardo's head, and for the first time in my life, I saw something other than hatred in his eyes. There was confusion, gratitude, and something that might have been respect. "Thompson," Carlos said quietly. "Rodriguez," I replied, but without the usual venom. "Thank you," Carlos said, the words seeming to physically pain him. "Thank you for saving my son." "Any man would have done the same," I replied. "No," Carlos said, shaking his head. "Not any man, not after ... everything." Miguel Jr. and Diego stood behind their father, looking as confused as I felt. The entire dynamic between our families had shifted in that moment. "Papa," Eduardo said, "Mr. Jake is nice. He's not bad like you said." Carlos winced at his son's words, realizing how the feud had poisoned even his youngest child's mind. "Eduardo is a good boy," I said. "You should be proud of him." "I am," Carlos replied. "Very proud." There was an awkward silence as we all stood there, not sure how to navigate this new territory. "Well," I said finally, "I should get going." "Thompson," Carlos called as I started to mount my horse. Would you like to come in for coffee? It's the least I can do." I looked at this man who had been my enemy for my entire adult life and saw a father who was grateful that his son was alive. "I'd like that," I said. As we walked toward the Rodriguez house together, I realized that sometimes it takes a crisis to show us what really matters. The feud that had defined our families for 3 generations suddenly seemed small and petty compared to the life of one innocent child. But I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a transformation that would change both our families forever. Walking into the Rodriguez house felt like entering enemy territory, but Carlos's gratitude for saving Eduardo created a temporary truce that allowed us to sit at the same table for the first time in our lives. The Rodriguez home was warm and inviting, with family photos covering the walls and the lingering scent of coffee and homemade bread. I could see touches that spoke of a woman's presence, probably Eduardo's mother before she passed away. "Sit, please," Carlos said, gesturing to a chair at the kitchen table. "Maria, bring coffee for Mr. Thompson." An older woman, who I assumed was the housekeeper, brought coffee and looked at me with undisguised curiosity. Word would spread quickly through town that Jake Thompson had been inside the Rodriguez house. Miguel Jr. and Diego sat across from me, still processing the surreal situation. Eduardo climbed onto his father's lap, still wearing the clothes I had given him. "Tell me what happened," Carlos said, his voice gentle but concerned. Eduardo recounted his story, how he had gotten off the school bus during the storm and tried to take a shortcut home through our properties, how he got disoriented in the blizzard and ended up lost near our fence line. "I thought I was going to die, Papa," Eduardo said quietly, "but then Mr. Jake found me and carried me to his house. He made me soup and let me sleep by the fire." Carlos listened intently, his weathered hands stroking his son's hair. When Eduardo finished, Carlos looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You kept him for 3 days," Carlos said. "The storm was too dangerous to travel," I replied. "I couldn't risk bringing him out in that weather. You could have called, phone lines were down. Power was out most of the time." Carlos nodded slowly. "And you ... took care of him?" "Of course I did. He's just a kid." "Just a kid," Carlos repeated, as if the words held some deeper meaning. Miguel Jr. spoke up for the first time. "Papa, maybe we should quiet." "Miguel," Carlos said firmly, but not unkindly. Eduardo looked up at his father. "Papa, why do you and Mr. Jake not like each other?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Carlos looked uncomfortable, glancing at me and then back at his son. "It's complicated, mijo. Mr. Jake said it was grown-up things that don't really matter." Carlos raised an eyebrow and looked at me. "Did he now? Kids shouldn't have to carry the weight of their parents' mistakes," I said quietly. "Mistakes?" Carlos's voice had an edge to it. "Poor choice of words," I said quickly. "I meant ... disagreements." Carlos studied me for a long moment. "Eduardo, go play in your room for a while. The adults need to talk." "But Papa..." "Go on, son." Eduardo reluctantly climbed down from his father's lap and left the room. But I could tell he was listening from the hallway. Once Eduardo was gone, the atmosphere in the room became tense again. Miguel Jr. and Diego shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "Thompson," Carlos said slowly, "I don't understand you. What do you mean? You saved my son, my youngest boy, the son of your enemy. You're not my enemy." "Carlos, what?" Carlos looked genuinely shocked. "You heard me. You're not my enemy. You never were. But the feud is something our grandfathers started over water rights 70 years ago. Something our fathers continued out of pride. Something we've been carrying on out of habit." Carlos leaned back in his chair. "Habit? When was the last time you and I actually had a real disagreement about something that mattered?" Carlos thought for a moment. "The fence line dispute last year, over 6 inches of land that neither of us really needed. The water rights issue 2 years ago, which we could have resolved with a simple conversation instead of lawyers." Carlos was quiet for a long time, processing what I was saying. "My father told me your family were thieves and liars," Carlos said finally. "My father told me your family were lazy and dishonest, and we believed them. We were kids. We didn't know any better." Miguel Jr. leaned forward. "So what are you saying? That the whole feud is pointless?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time we thought for ourselves, instead of carrying on our father's fights." Diego spoke up. "But what about everything that's happened? All the arguments, the legal battles, the waste?" I finished. "The complete waste of time, energy, and money that could have been spent on better things. Carlos stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his ranch. You know, Thompson, when Eduardo was missing, all I could think about was how I'd failed him. How I'd been so focused on hating your family that I hadn't been paying attention to what really mattered. What really matters. Family, love, being a good father. Carlos turned back to face me. When I saw you bringing my son home safe, I realized something. What? That you're a better man than I gave you credit for. The words hung between us, heavy with implication. Carlos, I said carefully, what if we tried something different? Like what? Like being neighbors instead of enemies. You think it's that simple? I think it's worth trying. Carlos returned to his seat and looked at his sons. What do you boys think? Miguel Jr. and Diego exchanged glances. Finally, Miguel Jr. spoke. Papa, I'm tired of the fighting. I'm tired of having to check which store the Thompsons are shopping at before we can go to town. I'm tired of teaching my own kids to hate people they've never even met. You have kids? I asked, surprised. 2 daughters, 4 and 6 years old. I didn't know. Why would you? We've never talked about anything except property disputes. Diego nodded in agreement. I feel the same way, Papa. The feud has controlled our whole lives. Maybe it's time to let it go. Carlos looked at me. And you, Thompson, are you really willing to put aside 3 generations of bad blood? Jake? I said. What? My name is Jake, and yes, I'm willing. Carlos extended his hand across the table. Carlos, I shook his hand, and in that moment, I felt like a weight I'd been carrying my entire life had been lifted from my shoulders. So what now? Miguel Jr. asked. Now we figure out how to be neighbors, I said. It won't be easy, Carlos warned. There are people in town who expect us to hate each other. Let them talk, I said. We know the truth. Eduardo appeared in the doorway, having obviously been listening to our conversation. Does this mean you and Papa are friends now? Mr. Jake Carlos and I looked at each other and smiled. Yes, mijo, Carlos said. I think it does. Eduardo ran over and hugged me around the waist. I'm glad. I like you, Mr. Jake. I like you too, Eduardo. Over the next few hours, we talked about practical matters. How to handle the boundary disputes that were currently in litigation. How to share water rights during dry seasons. How to coordinate our cattle operations so they didn't interfere with each other. But more importantly, we talked about our lives. Carlos told me about his late wife, Maria, and how much he missed her. I told him about my loneliness and how the feud had prevented me from forming meaningful relationships. You know, Carlos said, as the afternoon wore on, Maria always said the feud was foolish. She said life was too short to waste on hatred. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. I wish you could have met her. I wish I could have too. As evening approached, I knew I should head home, but I found myself reluctant to leave. For the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself. Jake, Carlos said, as I prepared to go, would you like to have dinner with us tomorrow? Nothing fancy, just family dinner. I'd like that very much. Good, come around 6. As I rode home that evening, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few hours. The man I'd been taught to hate had become someone I genuinely liked and respected. The family I'd been feuding with had welcomed me into their home, but I also knew that the real test would come when word got out about our reconciliation. There were people in town who had invested in our feud, who profited from our conflict, who wouldn't be happy to see it end. And there were deeper issues to address. Years of mistrust don't disappear overnight. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments when old habits and old resentments would resurface. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt hopeful about the future. I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could build something better than what our fathers had left us. As I unsaddled my horse and settled in for the night, I thought about Eduardo's innocent question. Why do you and Papa not like each other? The answer, I realized, was that we had never really tried to like each other. We had been so busy perpetuating old grievances that we had never given ourselves the chance to discover who we really were. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I went to sleep with a lighter heart than I'd had in years. The next evening, I arrived at the Rodriguez house at 6 o'clock sharp, carrying a bottle of wine and feeling more nervous than I'd expected. Ending a feud was one thing, building a genuine friendship was another entirely. Eduardo met me at the door with a huge grin. Mr. Jake Pappas, making his famous enchiladas. I can smell them from here, I said, ruffling Eduardo's hair. They smell incredible. Carlos appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on an apron. Jake, welcome. Come in, come in. The house felt different this time, warmer, more welcoming. Miguel Jr. and Diego were there with their families, and I was introduced to Miguel's wife, Sofia, and their two daughters, Isabella and Carmen. Diego's girlfriend, Ana, was also there. Uncle Jake, Isabella, the 6-year-old, announced suddenly. Isabella. Sofia scolded gently. It's okay, I said, kneeling down to Isabella's level. Uncle Jake sounds pretty good to me. The dinner was wonderful. Carlos's enchiladas were indeed famous for good reason, and the conversation flowed easily. We talked about ranching, the weather, the kids' school, activities, normal family conversation that felt revolutionary given our history. Jake Sofia said during dessert, Miguel told me you've never been married. Sofia, Miguel Jr. warned. It's okay, I said. No, I never married. The feud kind of consumed my family's life. There wasn't much room for anything else. That's sad, Ana said. You seem like you'd be a good husband and father. Maybe someday, I said. Though, at first, I wasn't sure that was realistic. There's always time for love, Carlos said quietly. Maria used to say that love finds you when you're ready for it, not when you're looking for it. After dinner, Carlos and I sat on the porch while the rest of the family cleaned up and the kids played in the yard. Jake, Carlos said, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about being neighbors instead of enemies, and I think we need to make it official. What do you mean? I mean we need to do something public, something that shows the whole community that the feud is over. I considered this. What did you have in mind? The county fair is next month. What if we entered a joint project? Something that shows we're working together. Like what? I don't know yet, but something visible. Something that makes a statement. Before I could respond, Eduardo came running up to the porch. Papa, Mr. Jake, come quick. Isabella fell off the swing. We rushed to the backyard, where Isabella was sitting on the ground, crying and holding her arm. It was clear she was hurt, but not seriously. Let me take a look, sweetheart, I said, kneeling beside her. I had some basic first aid training from my years on the ranch, and after a gentle examination, I determined that Isabella had likely sprained her wrist. We should get her to the doctor to be sure, I said. I'll drive, Carlos said. I'll come with you, I offered. At the small town hospital, we sat in the waiting room while Isabella was being examined. Other families in the waiting room kept staring at us. Carlos Rodriguez and Jake Thompson sitting together, clearly concerned. About the same child. People are talking, Carlos observed quietly. Let them talk. This is going to be all over town by tomorrow. Good. Maybe it'll help people understand that things have changed. Dr. Martinez, who had been treating both our families for years, came out with Isabella, her wrist in a small brace. Just a minor sprain, he said. She'll be fine in a few days. Thank you, doctor, Carlos said. Dr. Martinez looked between Carlos and me with obvious curiosity. I have to say, I never expected to see you two here together. Times change, doctor, I said. Indeed they do. Indeed they do. The next few weeks brought a series of small but significant changes. Carlos and I began coordinating our ranch operations, sharing equipment and labor during busy seasons. We discovered that cooperation was not only more pleasant than conflict, but also more profitable. Word of our reconciliation spread through the community like wildfire. Reactions were mixed. Some people were genuinely happy to see the feud end. Others seemed almost disappointed, as if they had been entertained by our conflict. The most challenging reaction came from some of the older residents who had been invested in the feud for decades. Jake Thompson, old Pete Morrison, cornered me at the feed store one day. What the hell do you think you're doing? What do you mean, Pete? Cozying up to them, Rodriguez boys. Your daddy would be spinning in his grave. My daddy held on to anger that wasn't his to begin with, I replied calmly. I'm choosing a different path. That family cost your grandfather thousands of dollars in legal fees, and we cost them just as much. All over what water rights that we could have shared from the beginning. Pete shook his head in disgust. You're making a mistake, boy. But for every Pete Morrison, there were others who supported what we were doing. The local pastor, Father Miguel, no relation to the Rodriguez family, approached me after church one Sunday. Jake, he said, what you and Carlos are doing, it's inspiring. It shows that forgiveness and reconciliation are possible, even after generations of hurt. Thank you, Father. Have you thought about sharing your story more widely? There are other communities dealing with similar feuds. Your example could help them. I hadn't thought about that, but it was an intriguing idea. Meanwhile, my relationship with the Rodriguez family continued to deepen. Eduardo had essentially adopted me as a surrogate uncle, and I found myself looking forward to our time together more than anything else in my week. Mr. Jake, Eduardo said one afternoon as we were working with the horses, "Do you think my mama would have liked you?" "I hope so, Eduardo. From what your papa tells me about her, she sounds like she was a wonderful woman. Papa says she always wanted peace between the families." "Then I think she would have been happy about what's happening now." "I think so too." Carlos and I eventually settled on our joint project for the county fair, a collaborative ranch display that would showcase both our operations and demonstrate how cooperation could benefit the entire community. We spent weeks preparing, working side by side in a way that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The display included information about sustainable ranching practices, water conservation, and community cooperation. The day of the county fair arrived, with perfect weather. Our display drew crowds all day, with people asking questions about our reconciliation and how we had managed to end such a long-standing feud. "The secret," Carlos told one visitor, "is remembering that we're all neighbors. We all want the same things: to take care of our families, to make a living, to live in peace. And sometimes," I added, "it takes a crisis to remind us of what really matters." That evening, as the fair was winding down, Carlos and I sat on hay bales, watching Eduardo and his nieces play games. "Jake," Carlos said, "I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "When Eduardo was missing in that storm, I prayed harder than I've ever prayed in my life. And when you brought him home safe, I knew God had answered my prayer in a way I never expected." "How so?" "He didn't just save my son, he saved both our families from a legacy of hatred." "Carlos, no, let me finish. Eduardo could have died that night, but instead, he lived, and his survival became the bridge between our families." "That's not coincidence, Jake. That's providence." "I thought about this. Maybe you're right." "No, I'm right, and I think we have a responsibility now." "What kind of responsibility?" "To make sure this legacy continues. To raise our children and grandchildren to choose love over hate, cooperation over conflict." "I don't have children or grandchildren." Carlos smiled. "You do now. Eduardo considers you family. So do Miguel's girls. You're part of our family now, whether you like it or not." The words hit me harder than I expected. For the first time in my adult life, I truly felt like I belonged somewhere. 6 months later, Carlos and I had become true partners, not just neighbors. We had combined some of our operations, shared resources, and even started planning a joint expansion. More importantly, we had become genuine friends. Carlos was the brother I never had, and his family had become my family. Eduardo, now 13, spent as much time at my ranch as he did at his own. He was learning everything I could teach him about horses and cattle, and I was learning from him about joy, innocence, and the power of unconditional love. "Mr. Jake," Eduardo said one evening as we watched the sunset from my porch, "I'm glad I got lost in that storm." "Why is that, son?" "Because it brought our families together. Because now I have you." "I'm glad to, Eduardo. You changed my life. How you taught me that love is stronger than hate. That family isn't just about blood. That it's never too late to choose a better path." As I tucked Eduardo into the guest room that had become his regular bedroom at my house, I reflected on how much my life had changed. The lonely cowboy who had lived for nothing but work and old grievances was gone. In his place was a man who was part of a loving, extended family. The feud that had defined 3 generations of Thompsons and Rodriguezes was over. In its place was a legacy of love, cooperation, and the understanding that we are all stronger together than we are apart. And it all started with one act of compassion on a stormy night, when I chose to save a child instead of perpetuating an old hatred. Sometimes the smallest acts of love create the biggest changes. Sometimes saving one life saves everyone. The end. Disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.